Good morning and good day. Welcome to 3:15 o'clock, that very channel where the unspoken becomes unforgettable. Do you have the courage to explore the stories they always wanted to hide from you? This is not just a horror channel. This is a place where silence is shattered by secrets, and every story carries a weight of fear it was never meant to bear. The first story, The Cold That Watches. My name is Travis Carter, and today I will tell you a true story I heard from my father, John Carter. The wind was bone-chilling, the tent was ripping apart from the gale, and the melody of that very wind sounded like a funeral dirge. But the real horror began with the silence that came after the storm. It was May 1992, Denali Mountain, Alaska, altitude 17,400 feet, the camp of 4. There had been 8 of them when they began the ascent. Now only 4 remained, entombed in a hand-dug snow cave in the slope, their only shelter from a 6-day hurricane that had hit the mountain with the fury of a biblical flood. The radio had long fallen silent, choked by static. The fuel for the stove ran out yesterday. The last crumb of chocolate was shared 3 days ago. The air in the cave was thick, stifling, poisoned by carbon dioxide and the smell of fear. "He's watching me," whispered Lex, the young photographer, his voice as dry as the crack of ice. His fingers, wrapped in dirty cloth, picked mindlessly at the cave wall. "Who?" Beck asked hoarsely, the most experienced among them. He sat with his head tucked into his shoulders, trying to preserve the last remnants of warmth. His face, frost-bitten and blackened, resembled a mask. He was nearly blind from corneal edema caused by altitude sickness, and the world was a blurry grey smear. To him, the one outside, Lex turned his gaunt, bearded face toward them. His eyes, unnaturally shiny, were wide open. "He walks around, listens. He was waiting for the storm to weaken us." "It's the wind, Lex," Sarah, the expedition's doctor, said wearily. Her rational mind clung to the last straws of logic, but her own nerves were stretched taut like strings. "Just the wind driving snow across the slope. Calm down. Save your strength." "The wind doesn't breathe like that," Lex whispered stubbornly. "And the wind doesn't have a voice like that. It whispers." Their fourth companion, Mike, was silent. He lay curled up in the farthest corner of the cave, turned toward the wall. He hadn't moved for several hours. Beck struggled to his feet, his joints creaking from the cold. He crawled over to Mike and shook his shoulder. "Mike?" "Hey, buddy, how are you?" Silence was the only answer. Beck brought his nearly sightless face close to Mike's. Not a sound of breath came from Mike's chest. His skin felt cold and waxy to the touch. "He's—" Beck began but didn't finish. At that moment, Mike's head snapped around. His eyes were open, but there was nothing human in them. Only a flat, glassy blackness like that of a deep-sea fish. His lips, chapped from the frost, twitched, and a sound erupted from his throat that was impossible to produce with human vocal cords. It was the grinding of ice against ice, the whistle of a blizzard in crevasses, the low, vibrational hum of the mountain itself. "Here. It's warm." Something hissed through Mike's mouth. Lex screamed and scrambled toward the exit. Sarah stood frozen in stupefaction. The scalpel of her medical knowledge was useless against this. Beck, driven by a blind instinct, recoiled. The creature wearing Mike's body slowly, with a nightmarish mechanical smoothness, rose. It didn't bend its knees. It simply hovered a few centimeters above the cave floor, its feet dragging through the snow. "Hungry." The same icy whisper sounded, filling the cave with the smell of permafrost and stone. It moved toward Sarah. She stood paralyzed with terror, unable to make a sound. The creature reached out a hand and touched her cheek. Where the frost-bitten fingers touched her skin, no white spot was left. The skin instantly blackened and charred, as if touched by liquid nitrogen. Sarah didn't scream. She simply exhaled the air from her lungs in a silent gasp, and her eyes rolled back, leaving only the whites. "Run!" Beck shouted, grabbing Lex by the jacket and shoving him out of the cave into the dazzling, merciless whiteness of the day. They ran, stumbling, falling into the deep snow, not choosing a path. Beck's blindness became their curse and their salvation. He couldn't see where he was running. He was just running from there. Lex, leading him, constantly looked back, his face distorted by panic. "It didn't come out. It's not following us," he exhaled, stopping to catch his breath. They were on an open slope. The wind had died down. The sun was blinding. It seemed they were saved, but the silence was even more terrifying than the storm. It was unnatural, oppressive, full of anticipation. And then they heard it. Not a whisper, but singing. It didn't come from behind, from the cave. It poured from above, from the very summit, and from below, from the glacial crevasses, and from inside their own skulls. It was an ancient pre-human melody, full of longing for a warmth it had never known. A melody that promised only eternal cold and the peace of oblivion. "It's not chasing us because we already belong to it," Lex realized in horror. "It has herded us into a trap. We're on the playing field, and it is the hunter." Their minds began to surrender. Hallucinations caused by altitude, hunger, and fear intertwined with the freezing reality. In the sun-glittering snow crystals, they saw faces. In the whistle of the wind, those very whispering voices. "Come to us. Become part of the whole. Shed the burden of warmth." Lex couldn't take it. He screamed, covered his ears with his hands, and ran downhill toward a visible, gentle saddle in the distance that seemed like salvation. "Stop! There's a crevasse there!" Beck shouted blindly, but it was too late. He heard a short cry, the sound of a fall, and then silence. Lex was gone, swallowed by the blue abyss of a glacial rift, its mouth skillfully disguised by fresh snow. Beck was alone, blind, lonely, in the center of a white hell. The cold squeezed his chest in a steel vice. He understood this wasn't just freezing. It was trying to get inside, to squeeze out the last drops of life from him, to take his warmth, his soul, to add to its collection. He collapsed into the snow, his strength leaving him. Consciousness was fading. In the last moments of clarity, he felt something approaching, not with steps, but with a sliding motion. A cold shadow fell over him. "Sleep," whispered the familiar icy voice right at his ear. "Your warmth is mine, now." Beck lost consciousness. He lay like that for several hours. His body was freezing, his life processes nearly halted. To any observer, he was dead. That's exactly how two survivors from another group found him, stumbling upon him on their way down. They saw a blackened, ice-crusted body and, taking pity, covered it with the remains of a sleeping bag, marking the spot with a pole. They couldn't carry him with them. They left him, as the dead are left, but it didn't take him completely. It only sampled him. It left a part of its cold inside him, its mark. When the people left, Beck's consciousness began to break through the thickness of ice and nothingness. It wasn't the will to life that lifted him from the abyss. It was pushing him out. The thing that had taken root in him couldn't stand stillness. It was bored. It needed new toys, new warmth. And down below, in the camp at 14,000 feet, lights were burning. There was life. And Beck stood up. His movements were unnaturally smooth, precise. He didn't stumble over wind-packed snow, didn't sink into the powder. He glided over it. His blindness was no obstacle. He saw the world differently. He saw thermal traces, the beating of hearts in the distance, fear like a bright flash in the cold darkness of the world. An ancient instinct, not his own, guided him down toward prey. He reached the camp like a ghost emerging from a blizzard. His appearance was a miracle that quickly turned into a nightmare. They laid him in a tent, tried to warm him up, gave him tea, but those who were closest to him noticed oddities. His skin remained burning cold. His breath didn't fog in the frost, and his eyes, if anyone looked into them too deeply, they glimpsed that same bottomless, glassy blackness in their depths. And then people in the camp started to disappear. First, the one who was on radio duty at night. He was found in the morning in a snowdrift, frozen to death at -20, with an expression of silent horror on his face and with absolutely black, icy fingers. Then the girl who had shared her tea with Beck disappeared. She was found in a glacial crevasse. Her body was as cold as if she had been lying there for weeks, not hours. Panic settled in the camp. They realized something was wrong. That rescue had brought death with it. By the time the heroic National Guard helicopter, risking their lives, broke through the fierce wind for evacuation, a quiet hysteria reigned in the camp. Beck, wrapped in a sleeping bag, was loaded on board. As the helicopter lifted off the ground, one of the pilots turned to check on the rescued man. Beck lay motionless, but from the folds of the sleeping bag, his hand was visible. And the pilot saw the fingers on that hand slowly, almost caressingly, tracing the metal skin of the cabin. And where they touched the steel, frost instantly appeared, followed by a web of the finest cracks, as if the metal had instantly frozen to brittleness. The pilot froze, looking out the porthole at the retreating white massif of Denali, and he fancied that the entire mountain was not just a pile of rocks and ice, that it was one huge, sleeping body, and that they had just taken away with them its tiniest, yet most greedy and dangerous particle, a particle that was now flying into a warm, densely populated world, full of such desirable, such generous warmth. And the silence in the helicopter cabin suddenly seemed to him the loudest and most ominous thing in the world. The second story, Depths That Call by Name. My name is Taylor. This story happened to my father. It's very difficult for me to remember that fateful year of 1989. A dull, deafening impact against rock reverberated through the entire hull of the ship, from the keel to the mastheads. The steel giant, the tanker MV Malaspina, shuddered with its entire 200-meter body, froze for an instant, and then let out a groan, a drawn-out, metallic, deathly groan. And it was immediately drowned out by an all-consuming silence. The electricity went out. The hum of the engines, the hiss of steam pipes, the voices on the radio fell silent. Only the furious howl of the wind outside remained, and an alarming growing rumble somewhere below, in the bowels of the ship. Captain Elijah Vargas froze in the complete darkness of his bridge, his fingers gripping the cold steel of the helm. Through the snow-blinded portholes, nothing was visible but murky, swirling darkness. That very roar that had come from under the hull was familiar to him. He had heard it only once in his life, 40 years ago, when his first ship ran aground. On a reef near the Aleutian Islands, the sound of rock tearing through steel. "Everyone remain at your posts. Report damage." His voice, accustomed to command, sounded hoarse and unnaturally loud in the tomb-like silence. In response, the ticking of a clock and the screech of ice floes against the hull. The radio was dead. The emergency generator didn't start. The bridge door flew open, letting in a whirlwind of icy air and the first mate, Miles. His face, illuminated by the flickering light of an emergency flashlight, was as white as the snow overboard. "Captain, we hit something. Tanks 2 and 3. They're filling up. Fast. Water is flooding the engine room." "Underwater rocks," Vargas whispered. "They shouldn't be here. They're not on the charts." "Captain," Miles's voice trembled. "Down. There. Below. There's another sound. Doesn't sound like water." Before Vargas could answer, the ship shuddered again, listing to port. A glass partition cracked. Somewhere deep in the hull, a deafening crash sounded, equipment breaking loose from its mounts. And through all this chaos, barely audible but all the more terrifying for it, came that other sound. Not just the roar of water rushing into the compartments. It was a grinding, metal on metal. No, more like the grinding of many claws, scraping from the inside against the bulkheads, trying to break out. The Malaspina slowly, inexorably leaned on its side, turning into an icy tomb for 37 men. The crew rushed to the lifeboats, but lowering them into the raging sea with such a list was impossible. One of the boats, breaking free from its davits, crashed into the black water and instantly disappeared into the foam and snow-churned abyss. "To the hold, everyone to the cargo hold." "It's the highest point," Vargas commanded. Understanding it was their last chance. The flight through the corridors, which had turned into icy, slippery pipes, was like a nightmare. The walls wept with frost. Icy steam shot out of the ventilation grates, and that sound, it grew louder. Now it wasn't just grinding. It was something like a whisper. Many voices merging into one icy, soulless hum coming from behind the steel walls. "Do you hear that?" shouted a young sailor named Jack, stopping and pressing his palms to his ears. "They're calling my name. They know my name." His comrade shoved him roughly forward. "Move. It's the wind in the pipes, or a hallucination from the cold." But it was no hallucination. They barricaded themselves in cargo hold number 1. 37 men, shivering from cold and fear, by the light of a few flashlights. Outside, the storm howled. The Malaspina groaned and settled deeper. The water was rising. The cold penetrated the steel, making the metal contract and crack. And then the last flashlight went out. Someone screamed. Someone began to pray. In the absolute impenetrable darkness, their hearing sharpened to unimaginable limits. They heard movement on the ceiling above them, on the deck, which was now almost a vertical wall. Not footsteps. Rather, a quiet, wet shuffling as if something heavy and wet was dragging its body across the iced metal. "Rats," the boatswain tried to convince himself. "Just ship's rats escaping." The shuffling stopped right above the hold hatch. A quiet, rhythmic scraping was heard. Something was scratching the steel from the outside. Methodically, relentlessly. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream came from the other end of the hold, a scream so full of primal dread that everyone's heart stopped. It was the stoker, Henry, screaming. "What is it?" "Henry," Vargas shouted, pointing his extinguished flashlight in that direction out of habit. But the darkness was absolute. Henry's screams turned into gurgling, choking sounds. A splash of water was heard, and a chomping, loud, wet, insatiable chomping, and a smell. A sweetish, rotten, unbearable stench of decay and the deep sea bursting into the hold, overwhelming the reek of fear and sweat. "Light! Give us light!" someone wailed. Someone frantically tried to light a lighter. The small flame tore a horrific picture from the darkness. Henry was lying on his back, in the icy water covering the floor. On his chest, hunched right over, his face, sat something. Humanoid but impossibly thin, with skin of a bluish-white, deathly waxen color. Long, bony limbs with webbing between the fingers gripped his head. The creature was doing something to his face. Teeth, claws. The lighter went out, leaving behind only a retina scorched by that nightmarish image and that terrible, wet sound. Pandemonium broke out in the hold. People rushed about in blind panic, bumping into each other, into piles of crates, falling into the icy water. Screams, prayers, cries of madness mingled into one dreadful chorus, and the scraping outside the hatch continued. And it was joined by new sounds, the same scraping, scratching from all sides. They were surrounded. They were inside the ship and outside. Vargas, pressing his back against the cold wall, understood. These weren't rocks. It was a trap. These creatures. They had caused the Exxon Valdez disaster as bait. They knew rescuers would come. They were waiting for fresh meat, locked in a steel trap, protected from the storm. Hunters, ancient, intelligent, merciless. "They're outside," someone shouted. "They're on the deck, dozens of them." The hold hatch was torn from its hinges with a crash. Against the backdrop of a slightly less black sky, a blizzard howled, and in the opening, one by one, silhouettes appeared. Tall, hunched, with long arms dragging along the deck. They descended into the hold unhurriedly, sliding rather than stepping. Their eyes, large and completely black, like those of deep-sea fish, reflected no light. They only absorbed it and the cold. They brought with them a freezing cold that made the air in the lungs freeze. The slaughter began. But not a massacre. There was no rage or malice. It was a cold, soulless harvest. The creatures grabbed people with their bony paws. Their touch caused instant frostbite. Flesh blackened and crumbled. They didn't kill immediately. They dragged their victims into the darkness, into the flooded compartments, from where only a last, bubbling gurgle and that same terrible, leisurely chomping could be heard. Vargas and a handful of sailors retreated, fighting back with wrenches, knives, bare hands. It was useless. The creatures didn't even pay attention. Their skin was hard, like frozen armor. The captain retreated to a far corner, into a small storeroom. He slammed the door and leaned against it, feeling several pairs of those same claws scraping at the metal from the outside. He was alone. In his jacket pocket was a chemical hand warmer, the last tiny source of heat in this kingdom of ice. The scraping suddenly stopped. Silence fell, broken only by the horrific sounds of feasting in the main hold. Then a quiet, hissing voice sounded, right at the crack of the door, a voice that sounded like cracking ice. "Vargas." Something hissed. It knew his name. "Warmth. Give the warmth." The door in front of him began to frost over. A thick, dense layer of ice crept over the metal, sealing the mechanism. The captain watched in horror as the door handle slowly turned into a block of ice. He understood. They weren't just being eaten. Their warmth, their life, their very energy, that's what they needed, what they absorbed like sponges. With mad determination, he pulled out the chemical warmer, broke it, activating the chemical reaction. The tiny heat source hissed in his palm. It was scalding hot. Outside, a furious scraping instantly erupted. The creatures were enraged by this flare of heat so close. They beat furiously against the door. Vargas pressed the warmer to his chest, feeling its heat seep through his clothing. It was a final act of defiance. He would not let them take him cold. He would die warm. The door was broken down with a crash. On the threshold filling the doorway stood it. Tall, thin, with bottomless black eyes in which all the frost of this cursed strait swirled. It stepped toward him, extending a long, bony paw with webbed fingers. Captain Elijah Vargas closed his eyes and exhaled a last stream of warm vapor. The rescue ship reached the site of the Malaspina's wreck 12 hours later, when the storm had subsided a little. The tanker lay on its side, half submerged, covered in a crust of ice like a huge dead fish. The rescue team in a boat made their way to its hull with great difficulty. The entire deck, all the superstructures, were encased in a thick layer of smooth, unnaturally even ice. Not a single crack, not a chip. It seemed the ship was frozen in a perfect sarcophagus. They found an entry hatch and began cutting a passage through the ice with torches. When they descended into the ship, horror gripped them. It was colder inside than outside. The walls, ceilings, floor, everything was covered in fluffy frost, like frost patterns. And there was an absolute, tomb-like silence. They found not a single body, no signs of a struggle, not a drop of blood. In the last hold, they found the only thing that broke the perfect icy symmetry. On the wall, someone had scratched words into the ice with a frozen knife or claw. Words that made seasoned sailors' blood run cold. They were here. They know our names. They are waiting for the next ones. And in the corner, sitting, leaning against the bulkhead, they found Captain Vargas. His body was completely frozen, covered in a thick layer of transparent glass-like ice. His face, visible through this shell, was contorted in a silent scream of inhuman horror. But the most terrifying thing was that he was clutching his hands tightly to his chest, and in them he held a small, completely empty, and also utterly frozen chemical hand warmer. And then one of the rescuers, the youngest, raised his flashlight higher and cried out. On the ceiling of the hold, also scratched, were maps, precise detailed maps of the entire Prince William Sound, and on them dozens, hundreds of new, unknown to science underwater rocks were marked, and arrows that pointed directly to the main shipping lanes. They weren't just waiting for the next ones, they were preparing new traps for them. My name is Mike Seddon. I will tell you a story about how our camping trip in the mountains ended horribly. It wasn't a roar, not the sound of breaking branches, but silence. Deep, all-consuming, unnatural silence that descended on the taiga like a shroud. That's what woke us up. Not screams, not sounds, but their complete absence. No squeaking of bats, no hooting of owls, not even the familiar rustle of leaves, as if someone had turned off the sound for the entire world. We were in Denali National Park, far from the beaten paths, in a place that was marked on the map as a scenic valley, but turned out to be a graveyard of ancient firs and silent black rocks. There were 3 of us, me, Mike, my younger brother Leo, a perpetual enthusiast with an insatiable thirst for adventure, and Sarah, his girlfriend, a biologist who was supposed to ensure our safety with her knowledge of nature. She was the one who insisted on this spot. This is the real, wild Alaska, not a Disneyland for tourists. The first evening was wonderful. We set up 2 tents, ours with Leo and Sarah's about 10 meters away, at the foot of a giant spruce tree. We lit a fire. Stu laughed. Sarah gave us a lecture on precautions, all provisions in special containers, hung on a steel cable between trees far from the camp. Not a crumb on the ground, bear spray in every tent, within reach. The main thing is not to panic. Black bears are timid, and grizzlies, if not provoked, usually avoid people, she said, her eyes gleaming in the firelight. How wrong she was. She was talking about animals. But what came to us at night was not an animal. I woke up because I froze. Not from a sound, but from a feeling. A sharp, nauseatingly familiar feeling, as if you're alone in an apartment and realize the door has just closed quietly. Leo was sleeping next to me, his steady breathing the only sound. And then I heard it. Not a rustle, not a footstep. It was a scrape. One slow, drawn-out scrape on the canvas of the tent from the outside right by my head, as if someone had dragged a long, hard fingernail across it. I froze, my heart pounding somewhere in my throat. Leo stirred. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, barely squeezing the air out of my lungs. He didn't answer. The scrape repeated. And again. And again. Now. It was no accident. It was a methodical, unhurried sound. Someone or something was slowly, deliberately dragging something sharp across our tent, in a circle. "Leo." I poked him in the side, my voice breaking into a shrill whisper. He sat up, instantly awake. In the dark, I could only see the white, wide-eyed whites of his eyes, scrape, scrape, scurr, rape. And then another sound joined it, breathing, low, hoarse, wet, not like a sleeping dog's. It was too slow, too deliberate. Inhale, a 5-second pause. Exhale, long, wheezing, as if from punctured lungs. And this sound was right outside, a centimeter from my ear. I panicked, grabbed the flashlight, found the button with trembling fingers. The beam of light, blinding in the pitch darkness, hit the tent wall, and we saw it. On the canvas, as on a shadow theater screen, appeared a huge, monstrously proportioned shadow. It was a head, but not a bear's. A bear's snout is shorter, its forehead more sloping. This one had a high, sloping forehead and an elongated muzzle, almost wolf-like, but more massive, more powerful. And the ears, God, the ears were too long and pointed like a bat's. The shadow turned slowly, sniffing the air. We heard its wet nose noisily inhaling the air, inhaling our scent. "Bear," Leo whispered, gasping, and reached for the pepper spray canister. The shadow froze, as if it had heard. The head turned toward us, and we saw the outline of its maw in profile. It was slightly open, and a long, black, unnaturally long tongue hung from it. It slowly dragged across the tent fabric, leaving a wet, dark trail. It was not a bear. It began to walk. Slowly, incredibly heavily. Its shadow moved in a circle around our tent. We sat back to back, clutching the canisters in our sweaty palms, ready for an attack that seemed as pointless as spitting into a hurricane. "It will leave," Leo muttered hysterically. "It will sniff and leave," Sarah said. Suddenly, the shadow vanished. The breathing stopped. It became quiet. Too quiet. Did it leave? I dared to exhale. At that moment, from outside, right above our heads, came a sound that made the blood freeze in our veins. It wasn't a roar. It was laughter. Low, guttural, full of absolute inhuman mockery. It lasted a few seconds, then was replaced by a dull blow to the tent, so powerful that the poles bent and we almost collapsed on top of each other. Then, footsteps. heavy, receding. We sat, not breathing, listening. The footsteps faded into the distance. God, what was that? Leo was crying, his body shaking with coarse tremors. I didn't answer. I was listening, and through the beating of my own heart, I heard a new sound, muffled, coming from the direction of Sarah's tent. A glassy, vibrating sound. Ding, ding, ding. As if someone was dragging a claw across the strings of the guitar that hung on the flip bracket of her tent. Sarah, I whispered. Silently, having agreed with our eyes, we dared the unthinkable. We had to check. Slowly, centimeter by centimeter, I unzipped the tent and looked outside. The night was moonlit. Silvery light flooded the clearing. Our food bags hung in their place, untouched. Nothing was visible. And then my gaze fell on Sarah's tent. The door was unzipped. The flap was thrown back, and moonlight poured from inside. And on the white canvas of her tent, as on a canvas, a single word was scrawled by a giant paw, scratched so deeply that the fabric hung in tatters. A word that made our hair stand on end. Thank you. We rushed over, screaming her name. The tent was empty. The sleeping bag was wide open, cold inside. Her backpack had been neatly gutted, all items sorted into piles. The can of bear spray lay on the pillow, untouched. There was not a drop of blood, no signs of a struggle. Only a terrifying, inexplicable neatness. And that word, that ghastly, mocking thank you. And on the floor, next to her sleeping bag, lay that very fingernail. A long, curved, black and sharp shard of a claw like a dagger. It was sticky to the touch and smelled of bear, swamp muck, and something else. Sweetish, chemical, like formalin. We panicked, grabbed the essentials, and ran. We ran all night, stumbling over roots, lashing our faces with branches, not choosing a path. We ran from that place, from that word, from that laughter. We were lucky. In the morning, we reached a tourist trail and were picked up by a group of rangers. We were breathless, trying to tell them. They looked at us with pity and skepticism. Two frightened city boys spinning wild tales about a forest monster. They searched our tent, found that claw. Looks like a Kodiak bear claw, said the senior ranger, turning it over in his hands. A huge specimen. You're incredibly lucky it just scratched your tent and left. As for your friend, he sighed heavily. Bears sometimes drag people away. Quickly and quietly. There couldn't be any thank you. You're in shock, you imagined it. You could not believe him. He was an authority. He knew these woods, but he didn't see that shadow. He didn't hear that laughter. Sarah was never found. The search yielded nothing. The official version is a bear attack. 3 months have passed. I'm trying to get back to life. Leo has turned to drink. He can't sleep without a light on. He says he hears scraping on the glass of his third-floor apartment at night. And yesterday I received a package. No return address. In a cardboard box lay Sarah's guitar, the very instrument whose strings were stroked by a claw that night. A note was tied to the neck. The paper was rough, stained with dirt and something dark, sticky. The text was written not in ink, but in something brown, and the letters were carefully, almost calligraphically formed. Thank you for the meal. She was sweet. We await the next. Spring will be long and hunger. My name is Leslie Snowy. This happened to my college friends. I'll tell you now. We thought it would be the most romantic adventure of our lives. To ditch everything, buy ferry tickets to Alaska, hire a small plane to Skagway, and from there, just our feet, a tent, and the vast, piercingly beautiful wilderness. We wanted to escape the office noise, the constant hum of cars, and the intrusive glow of screens. We were searching for silence. We found something entirely different. The car we rented in Skagway rattled over every bump of the old logging road, taking us further and further from any signs of civilization. The maps showed only approximate outlines, but we were confident. Ethan was driving, and I was in the passenger seat with a tablet open on my lap, trying to match the satellite images with the reality outside the window. "I think we turn here." I pointed to a barely noticeable track leading into a thicket of spruce trees. Ethan snorted skeptically but turned. Branches whipped against the windows as if trying to drive us away. After half an hour of jolting, we drove out into a small clearing, bounded on one side by a rocky slope and on the other by a dark wall of forest. And in the middle of the clearing, nestled against the rock, stood it. The cabin. It was exactly what an abandoned prospector's cabin from the gold rush era should be. Low, slanted, built from logs blackened by time. The roof, made of rough slabs, had collapsed in several places. The window was boarded up with a rotten plank. The air smelled of damp rot, pine needles and something else, a sweetish, ancient scent of desolation. "Wow." Ethan exhaled, killing the engine. "Real history, just like in those blogs you read." I nodded, but for some reason, no delight came. Instead, a light, cold shiver ran down my spine. The place was lifeless. Not just quiet, but dead. Not a single bird sang. No insects chirped. Only the wind rustled the tops of the giant spruces, and that sound was like a heavy, weary sigh. "It's too creepy, Ethan. Maybe let's go further, find somewhere brighter." "What are you talking about? It's perfect." He was already jumping out of the car, breathing in the cold air with his whole chest. "Real atmosphere. We'll set up camp right here. Look at the wind protection from the cliff." Arguing was useless. His enthusiasm was always contagious. But now I only felt a growing anxiety, irrational and sticky like a spider's web. While Ethan unloaded the tent and sleeping bags, I approached the cabin. The door hung on one hinge, slightly ajar into a black slit of interior space. I pushed it, and it gave way with a creak. Inside, it was dark and cramped, a feeling of time having stopped 100 years ago. In the corner, a pile of rot that had once been a cot, a small iron stove, rusted through. On a crude table made of an unhewn log stood a tin cup. I mechanically reached for it, but immediately pulled my hand back. Touching it felt like a sacrilege. It was the only object that didn't look completely destroyed by time. It even had traces of paint on it. A faded red stripe. It seemed alien, not belonging to this gloomy place, as if someone had left it there very recently. "Leah, come help," Ethan called. I hurried out into the light, trying to shake off the dark thoughts. We quickly set up the tent about 20 meters from the cabin, facing the forest, with our backs to the cliff. The sky in the west was rapidly burying the sun behind heavy, leaden clouds. "It's going to rain," Ethan stated, finishing with the guy lines. He wasn't wrong. The first heavy drops began to drum on the tent fabric almost as soon as we got inside and zipped up the entrance. Soon, the drumming turned into a solid, booming downpour. The wind grew stronger, swaying the treetops and stretching the tent, fly like a sail. We sat, huddled together by the light of a gas lantern, drinking tea and listening to the symphony of the elements. It seemed the whole world had shrunk to this small, bright dome, outside the walls of which a storm was raging. It was because of this all-encompassing noise that we didn't make out the other sound at first. I froze with the mug in my hands. "Did you hear that?" "The rain?" "Yeah, that's all it is." Ethan smiled. "No, not the rain." We fell silent, listening, and through the noise of the water, through the howling of the wind, something else reached us. Clear, undeniable. Shuffling. Slow, heavy steps on wet gravel. Someone was walking around our tent. My heart sank. My fingers turned cold. "Ethan?" I whispered. He put a finger to his lips. His face became serious, alert. He slowly reached for the large flashlight lying by the entrance. "A bear?" I breathed out. "In this weather?" "Doubtful," he replied just as quietly. The steps were too regular for an animal. It was a rhythmic, measured human stride. "Definitely." Step pause. Step pause. Someone was slowly walking in a circle, right next to the walls of the tent. We held our breath. I could feel my heart pounding wildly and was sure the thumping was audible from outside. And then, a voice broke through the noise of the rain. Quiet, cracked, monotonous. It wasn't singing so much as mumbling, in a chant, the same infinitely sad melody. The words were impossible to make out, only an endless, mournful tune, so full of sorrow and hopelessness that tears began to stream down my cheeks of their own accord. It was the sound of absolute, all-consuming loneliness. Ethan, pale as a sheet, gripped the flashlight so hard his knuckles turned white. "Hey, who's there?" he shouted, and his voice, usually so confident, trembled. The steps stopped. The singing ceased. A silence fell, now seeming even more sinister than that eerie chant. All that could be heard was the rain beating against the fabric. We didn't breathe, expecting anything. A blow to the tent, a growl, a scream. But nothing happened. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The tension began to ease slightly. "He's gone," Ethan whispered, exhaling. "Some drifter, probably. Missing his cue for a ghost tour." He tried to joke, but the joke fell flat and unconvincing. We didn't sleep until morning, sitting embraced and listening to every rustle. But nothing else disturbed the night's peace except for the bad weather. Dawn came grey and damp. The rain had turned into a drizzling mist. I felt shattered, my nerves stretched taut like strings. Ethan, trying to look cheerful, was the first to climb out of the tent. "No one, see? No tracks, no—" He fell silent mid-sentence. I climbed out after him and saw what he was staring at. Right in front of the tent entrance, on the wet gravel, lay an object. A rusty tin gold panning cup. The same one I had seen yesterday on the table in the cabin, but now it was here. At its bottom, mixed with rainwater, lay a small handful of wet yellow sand and a few small but absolutely real gold nuggets. And next to the cup, in the sodden earth, was an imprint. A clear, distinct mark from a rough boot. A single one. As if someone had approached, placed the cup, and frozen, staring at our tent. Vanished. We silently packed up the camp, our movements sharp, automatic. I didn't look at Ethan. He didn't look at me. We were too scared to admit to each other what we had seen and heard. Our minds desperately clung to logical explanations, a hoax, a local madman. But on an animal, primal level, we knew. We knew it was something else. We had almost everything loaded into the car when an SUV from the National Park Service came around the bend onto the clearing. A ranger was driving, a man in his 50s with a tired, weathered face. He looked surprised to see us. "Early. Birds," he said, getting out of the car. "Or just lost. This road doesn't go anywhere. We camped here for the night," Ethan answered, and his voice still sounded strained. The ranger glanced at our tent, now almost packed up, then looked at the cabin, and his expression changed. Weariness was replaced by wariness and slight pity. "I see," he drawled. "So, not a peaceful night?" We exchanged glances. His question didn't sound like a formality. "Why do you ask?" I asked quietly. The ranger sighed, pulled a thermos from a leather case on his belt, poured himself some coffee, and gestured to offer us some. We silently declined. "This place, it has a bad reputation. Locals try not to come here. Haven't seen tourists here for about 5 years." "A ghost?" Ethan blurted out, and his voice held a hope that it was still someone's stupid joke. The ranger was silent for a moment, looking at the cabin. "You could call it that. Legend says a guy lived here, Jack McClure, one of the thousands who came here during the gold rush, hungry for wealth. Found a vein, a good one. But it was a prime spot. Everyone wanted a piece. One day he came back from working his claim to find it. His claim had been jumped by a gang of lowlifes. He tried to fight. They didn't go easy on him. Took everything he'd gathered and threw his body down a mine shaft back there. Behind the cliff, he pointed his hand deep into the forest. They say he never came to terms with it, never found his gold, can't move on, he's still looking for it, and sometimes he comes out to people, asks, sometimes just watches, and leaves. Souvenirs." I looked at the cup I was clutching in my hand. It suddenly felt icy. "What does he ask?" I whispered. The ranger looked at me, and there was no mockery or doubt in his eyes. Only heavy, weary truth. He asks, "Have you seen my gold?" And sometimes he offers a deal, leaves a little gold as a down payment. And then he comes back for the payment, for the settlement. We silently got into the car and drove away. I watched in the side mirror until the cabin disappeared from view, clutching that same cup in my hands. We didn't tell the ranger about it. I don't know why. Maybe because of the greedy glint in Ethan's eyes when he saw the nuggets. Maybe because of some dark, whispering curiosity inside me. A week passed. We returned home to our cozy, safe world. But something broke. That night's horror wouldn't let go. We stopped talking about the incident, but it hung between us like a heavy, unspoken secret. Ethan became withdrawn. He could sit for hours on end, staring at those few grains of gold we had brought back, sifting them from hand to hand. And then it started. First, there were sounds at night. Not in the forest, but here in the city. I would wake up hearing, through the sound of rain outside the window, and it had been raining non-stop all these days for some reason. Quiet, shuffling steps under our balcony, and that same cracked, monotonous chant. It was quieter than it had been in the forest, but that only made it clearer. Then I started finding sand. Yellow, coarse prospector's sand. On the mat by the front door, on the windowsill, in the pocket of my robe. Ethan didn't hear or see anything. He retreated deeper into himself. His obsession with that gold grew. He scoured the internet, looked at old maps, calculated where Jack McClure's claim might have been. He barely slept anymore. His eyes burned with a feverish gleam, very similar to the one that must have been in the eyes of the prospectors of the past. "He's just showing me the way, Leah," he said to me one morning. "He wants me to find it. Our gold, our fortune." There was a strange, eerie certainty in his voice. That night, I woke up because the apartment was cold. Frosty air, smelling of pine needles and damp earth, filled the bedroom. Ethan was sleeping restlessly, tossing and turning and mumbling something in his sleep, and I saw him. He was standing in the corner of the room, illuminated by moonlight. A tall, thin, almost transparent silhouette in tattered, soaking wet clothes. His face wasn't visible, just a shadow under the brim of a sodden hat. But I could feel his gaze. A gaze of endless, insatiable craving. He slowly raised his hand. In his pale, almost skeletal fingers was that same rusty cup. He held it out in our direction, toward the bed. The gesture was both an offering and a terrible accusation. I squeezed my eyes shut, burying my face in the pillow, trying to scream but making no sound. When I dared to look again, there was no one in the corner. But on the floor, on the parquet, was a wet trail of gravel and yellow sand, leading from the corner straight to our bed. And in the sand were the clear imprints of rough boots. My name is Russell. I'm 24 years old. I love solitude, travel, and previously unknown routes, and this story happened to me last year. Silence is not the absence of sound. Silence is a different kind of sound. It has density, taste, weight. It presses on the eardrums, makes the blood pound in your temples louder than any drum, and your own breathing seems like the deafening roar of a jet engine. I know this. I was searching for it, and I found something that silence was hiding in its womb. My name is Russell, and I am a professional at running away from the world. My life is a network of routes through the most remote corners of the planet, where the only Wi-Fi is the crack of twigs underfoot, and the only notifications come from changes in the weather. I was searching for the absolute, the final frontier, beyond which there is only you and the universe, stripped of human noise. Such a place was supposed to be the valley of the Chulitna River in Alaska. Deaf, inaccessible, cut off from civilization by a ring of impregnable mountains. The maps showed only approximate outlines. Satellite images showed a green sea of taiga, split by a turquoise thread of a river. Perfect. The helicopter, an old Bell piloted by a grim Aleut named Jack, dropped me on a gravel spit, a 2-day walk, from the presumed center of the valley. Are you sure this is the right place? His voice, after half an hour of rotor thunder, seemed unnaturally loud. The place is strange. That's the point. I grinned, unloading the last backpack. No, you don't understand. It's too quiet here. He paused, looking at the dark wall of forest pressing right up to the water. Not naturally quiet, but empty. Birds don't sing. Animals avoid it. The locals don't hunt here. Legends? I asked with a touch of professional condescension. Don't know, just quiet, as if someone sucked out all the sounds. Listen, I can come back in 4 days, not 7. No need. Exactly in 7. He shook his head, muttered something under his breath, and without saying goodbye, climbed into the cockpit. The helicopter roared, kicked up a whirlwind of gravel and dust, lifted off the ground, and disappeared behind a jagged ridge of mountains. And then it happened. A wave of sound surged and receded. The echo of the rotors dissolved into the air, and in its place came something. Not just an absence of noise, a physical sensation of vacuum. The air became thick, like jelly. The pressure in my ears increased, as if I'd dived to a depth of 100 meters. I froze, and in this sudden muteness, my own heartbeat sounded like a dull drumbeat somewhere inside my skull. Inhale. Exhale. the rush of blood in my vessels. That was all. Nothing more. No rustle of leaves, no buzzing of insects, no whine of mosquitoes. No bird's cry. Even the river, wide and surely powerful, flowed in complete silence. Its water rolled over boulders but didn't make a single sound. It was eerie, unpleasant, unnatural. I felt a slight panic, a cold tickle in the pit of my stomach. I took a deep breath and forced myself to smile. This is exactly what you wanted, Russell. Absolute silence. Welcome. The first day was the hardest. My brain, unaccustomed to such sensory starvation, rebelled. It pulled fragments of melodies, announcers' voices, the sound of a keyboard from my memory. I caught myself monotonously whistling. Nothing, just to fill the void. But the whistle died, producing no echo, swallowed by the all-consuming stillness. I set up camp on a high bank, away from the soundless river. The habitual actions, pitching the tent, lighting a fire, the fire also burned silently without crackling, were calming. Night fell, black, moonless. The stars hung motionless and just as soundless in the sky. I crawled into my sleeping bag and fell into a sleep that was just as deaf and silent. The second day began with the same oppressive silence, but now I was starting to get used to it. The panic receded, replaced by a strange euphoria. I was the only sounding object in the entire universe, the god of my own microcosm. I spoke aloud to myself, and my voice fell to the ground like a heavy stone, not bouncing, not reflecting. I enjoyed this anomaly, writing in my journal. Day 2. Acoustic vacuum stable, sensations fantastic. Audibility of my own body is 100%. I think I can hear my hair growing. By the evening of the second day, everything changed. Was sitting by the fire, or rather by the silent hearth with a flame, eating stew and listening to the beating of my heart. And suddenly, at the very bottom of that beat, I caught something else. Barely noticeable scratching. I froze, held my breath. The silence remained the same, deaf and absolute. But inside it, at the very edge of perception, there was something. As if someone had run a wet finger over glass. I strained my hearing, turned my head. The sound didn't get louder or change location. It was everywhere and nowhere. It came from the darkening forest, from the river, from the stones under my feet, from the air itself. It was a whisper, an indistinct white noise consisting of millions of microscopic sounds merged into a single monotonous hum. At first I thought it was the wind, but there was no wind. The leaves on the trees didn't stir. I wrote it off as fatigue, a trick of the mind, desperately trying to find some external stimulus. Auditory hallucinations, I wrote confidently in my journal. A classic effect of sensory deprivation. The brain starts generating noise on its own. But at night, the whisper grew louder. It didn't break the silence. It was part of it. It was the silence itself that had suddenly found a voice. I lay in the tent, and this whisper surrounded me, enveloped me like a cocoon. It flowed along the tent walls, seeped through the ground. It wasn't chaotic white noise. It had structure, rhythm. It was like a distant conversation in an unknown language, like the murmur of a stream, like the rustle of pages in an old book. Sometimes I thought I was about to make out individual words, as if someone was calling my name, as if someone was arguing, as if someone was crying. I didn't sleep. I pressed my head into the pillow, plugged my ears with my fingers, but it didn't help. The whisper wasn't born outside. It originated inside my skull, but it was alien. It was a product of my brain, but I couldn't control it. It was the most terrifying sensation of my life, to be alone in absolute silence and yet feel that you are not alone, because your own mind has started speaking to you in a language you don't understand. By the morning of the third day, I was on the edge. The whisper didn't cease for a second. It became the background of my existence. I walked around the camp, and it walked with me, whispering something in my ear. I tried to shout to drown it out, but my own cry drowned in this whisper like a stone in a swamp. It was stronger, and then I began to understand. It happened suddenly. I was sitting on the bank, looking at the soundless water, and the whisper, as usual, poured out in a continuous stream. And suddenly, it folded into a clear, distinct phrase. Quiet, spoken in the same impersonal, monotonous whisper, but absolutely understandable. Should not have come here. I shuddered and turned around. No one. Just the forest, the stones, and the oppressive silence now filled with meaning. "Who's there?" I croaked. My voice sounded pathetic and stupid. In response, the whisper fell silent for a moment, then resumed with new force, now with a hint of irritation, impatience. "He hears us. Deep, alone. We'll stay." Phrases washed over each other, intertwined, were born from nothing and went nowhere. It was a choir. Millions of voices speaking at once, and yet it was one voice. The voice of the valley itself. This was not psychosis. I could have dealt with psychosis. This was something else. My brain, deprived of external data, was desperately trying to process something. And it found something. It tuned into the frequency on which this very silence was broadcasting. It became an antenna, picking up the whisper of the stones, the trees, the water, and the earth. A whisper that had always been there, but which was never heard because of the noise of civilization, because of the wind, because of life. It was the voice of loneliness itself, the voice of emptiness, the voice of eternity, which was here before me and will be after. And this voice was angry. No, not angry. Indifferent, cold. As indifferent as stones in a scree are to each other, and in this indifference lay the true horror. Bone is broken. Cold. Mom. No one will find. Like that other one, with the red beard. They knew me. They saw me. They remembered everyone who had come here, and everyone who had stayed. I ran. I abandoned the camp, grabbed a backpack with the essentials, and ran downstream to where the helicopter was supposed to wait in 4 days. The whisper ran with me. It came from under my feet, from the air I was breathing. Where? Still. Here. Ours. I ran all day, stumbling over silent stones, pushing through the soundless forest. I fell, got up and ran on, clamping my ears with my palms, trying to tear this alien voice out of my head. But it was inside. It had become a part of me. By evening I was exhausted and collapsed at the foot of an old spruce. I cried. I begged them to stop. The whisper in response became quieter, more affectionate, but that only made it scarier. Sleep. Rest. We are with you forever. I slipped into oblivion, into a nightmare where I was a stone, silent and unfeeling. And people came to me, fell down nearby, and began to whisper, and their whisper lasted an eternity. I don't know how much time passed. Hours a day? I lay and looked into the soundless sky, and the whisper had almost merged with my thoughts. I almost stopped understanding where I was and where they were. And suddenly, first, it was a barely noticeable change in pressure. Then, a distant growing rumble. It cut the silence like a knife. The whisper became agitated, hissed, tried to get louder to drown it out. But the rumble grew. It was a sound, a real, physical, crude sound of an engine, a helicopter. And as it approached, the whisper began to weaken. It melted like smoke in the wind, broke into incoherent fragments, lost its strength and meaning. I raised my head and saw a metal dragonfly in a break in the clouds. It was flying in the distance, not even towards me, just crossing the edge of the valley, but it was enough. The sound of its rotors, crude, mechanical, alien to this place, tore apart the acoustic vacuum. It was like a switch being flipped. The whisper cut off, immediately, sharply, as if it had never been. There was just silence. Ordinary, natural, albeit still oppressive, but familiar. I heard the wind stirring the branches of the spruce above my head. I heard my own moan. I lay and cried, sobbing with happiness and horror, listening to the gasoline heart of the helicopter, which was my salvation. Jack found me the next day. He didn't say, "I told you so." He just silently helped me into the cockpit. When we took off and the Chulitna Valley floated beneath us like a green, silent grave, he leaned toward me. "Well, found your silence?" I looked at him. I wanted to tell him everything. About the whisper, about the voices, about how the silence spoke to me, but I just nodded and turned to the window. I returned to the city, returned to the noise of cars, people's voices, the blare of music from neighbors' windows. I never turn off the light at night. I always leave the TV or radio on the quietest whisper setting, just to have background noise, just to fill the space. Because I'm afraid. I'm afraid that if it gets too quiet, I'll start listening again. And I will hear, and I will understand that it's not a hallucination, that the voices haven't gone anywhere. They are always there, in the very depths of the silence. They are, waiting for all the sounds to die down again, for the world to fall silent. And then they will speak to me again, and this time I might understand them. My name is Leo Jr. Scandani. I love my friends very much, and we often vacation together. We went to Alaska for freedom, for a breath of air so pure you could almost drink it, for a silence that rings in your ears louder than any metropolis. We found both the air and the silence, and something else, something ancient and hungry. There were 5 of us, me, Leo, his girlfriend Anya, our mutual friend Mike, and his younger sister, the ever-present 19-year-old Yulia, who had begged to come with us to make content for her travel blog. Our destination was a lake at the foot of the Mendenhall Glacier, reachable only by off-road vehicle and then on foot along a barely visible trail. A place untouched by civilization, the perfect spot. The first signs began a kilometer before the lake. A faint, barely audible hum, like a distant generator. The air, once crystal clear, acquired a strange vibration, as if trembling with tension. "Do you hear that?" Yulia asked, frowning and stopping. She turned her camera towards the forest, a sort of hum. "Bees or noise from the glacier," Mike dismissed, the older brother who always knew best. "Keep moving, or we won't get there before nightfall." But here, in the height of summer, there was no night. There was a white night, that ghostly twilight state where the sun only briefly touches the horizon, painting everything in lilac and golden tones. We walked in this surreal light, and the hum grew louder. And then we reached the lake. The sight was surreal and simultaneously terrifying. The water was a perfect mirror, reflecting the snowy peaks and the turquoise ice of the glacier. The air above the water trembled. A dark, almost black cloud seethed, pulsated, right over the shore. This was the swarm, a mosquito swarm. But we had never seen mosquitoes like these. They were larger than usual, with long, almost elegant legs, and their bodies had a metallic, steely sheen. Mother of God. Leo exhaled. Well, we came prepared. Nets, DEET repellent, we did everything. The repellent, which we generously doused ourselves with right then, had no effect. None whatsoever. The mosquitoes weren't just unafraid of it, they seemed to enjoy it, like a condiment. They took their first victim immediately. Yulia, who had approached the water's edge to film a panorama, cried out. We turned. Her arm, raised with her phone, had turned black from the insects covering it. They weren't just biting, they were enveloping it in a dense, writhing sleeve. With wild shouts, we rushed to her, waving our arms. It was like hitting thick smoke. Our hands plunged into the swarm. Brushing off dozens, but hundreds more immediately took their place. Their bites were painful, like jabs from red-hot needles. We somehow dragged Yulia back to the campsite we were hastily setting up further from the water. Pitching the tents became a hellish ordeal. Mosquitoes flew into our eyes, noses, and mouths. They crawled under our clothes, burrowed into the skin of our eyelids and earlobes. We worked in silence, teeth clenched, our faces twisted in grimaces of disgust and pain. Their hum drowned out everything. It was inside our skulls. It vibrated in our bones. When we crawled into the first pitched tent, it wasn't much better. We zipped up the mosquito net, and within a second it turned black. A layer of insects so dense had stuck to the outside that they blocked out the dim light of the white night. It became dark as a cellar inside the tent. We sat in the semi-darkness, illuminated only by the screen of Yulia's phone, and listened. The quiet, furious rustle of millions of wings scraping against the net. A constant, nerve-wracking sound, promising that this barrier was unreliable. I can't do this, Anya cried, wrapped head to toe in her sleeping bag, but even there, inside, her muffled sighs and the annoying whine of one or two mosquitoes that had managed to get in could be heard. Hunger took its toll about 2 hours later. We had to eat. Mike, the toughest of us, volunteered to cook. We watched his exit outside, pressed against the net like prisoners. He unzipped the tent, slipped out, and immediately zipped it shut behind him. Outside, a frantic dance began. He darted around, waving his arms, trying to open the backpack with provisions. His figure would disappear from view, completely hidden by the black swarm, then reappear. He returned after 5 minutes. His face looked like bubble wrap, a mass of red welts. In his hands, he clutched a pack of crackers and a chocolate bar. "Can't," he rasped, falling to his knees and shaking off dozens of insects that had flown in with him. "Out there. It's impossible out there. They get into the food. They're eating it." He showed us the chocolate bar. A few mosquitoes writhed on the bar, their crushed bodies mingling with the brown mass. Dinner was cancelled. We tried to drink water, straining it through our teeth, spitting out tiny, crunchy bodies. Yulia threw up. The night that wasn't stretched on infinitely. Sleep was impossible. The whisper of wings beyond the wall, the constant fear that the net would tear, that they would find a gap. And the bites. They didn't just itch. They burned. The wounds were inflamed and throbbing. Yulia developed a fever. She was delirious, shaking with chills, even though it was stuffy in the tent. In the morning, if it could be called morning, the situation hadn't improved. There was no more light. The layer of mosquitoes on the tent had only grown denser. We lived in a sticky, stuffy darkness, the air thick with our fear and sweat. "We're leaving. Right now," Leo announced, his voice trembling. Everyone nodded, silently. Packing up was like a frantic escape from a besieged fortress. We jumped out one by one, holding our breath, yanking up stakes, dumping the tents into wet, sticky piles without even trying to fold them. The mosquitoes blinded us, crawled into our ears, their hum paralyzing our minds. We breathed them in. We abandoned half our gear. We didn't have the strength to carry it. Mike carried Yulia on his back. She was moaning weakly, her face unrecognizably swollen. We ran down the trail, stumbling, falling, scraping our knees bloody, which were immediately covered with a new layer of insects. And then Leo, who was running ahead, screamed. Not a cry of pain or fear, but a scream of pure animal panic. He stopped, pointing a finger forward. The trail ended. Before us was a wall of mosquitoes. They had gathered into an unimaginably dense mass, utterly black, impenetrable. They formed a barrier between the tree trunks, from the ground to the very tops. This wall hummed. It was the horn of an ocean liner, the roar of a jet engine. It vibrated, and the ground beneath our feet seemed to vibrate in unison. "This is impossible." Mike howled. "We came this way." We darted to the side into the thicket, hoping to go around. 20 meters later, an identical wall stopped us, and to the right. We were trapped, in the center of a giant living circle that slowly, inexorably began to contract. They weren't just flying. They were acting, in concert, like a single intelligent, predatory organism. Retreating, we came out onto the lakeshore again. With our backs to the icy water, we watched the advancing darkness. The hum was so loud we couldn't hear our own screams. Anya prayed. Leo hugged her, and then Yulia, who Mike had set on her feet, weakly stretched her hand forward. "Look, her voice was barely audible over the roar. They're not just biting." We looked closer. The mosquitoes in the front rows weren't rushing at us. They were landing on the ground, on the rocks, on the tree trunks, and laying eggs. Tiny, black, shiny eggs. They covered everything around us, and we understood. They didn't just want our blood. They were preparing this place for their offspring. They were cleansing it of us. The first step forward wasn't taken by the swarm, it was taken by Leo. His eyes were glazed over. A quiet, insane phrase escaped his lips. "Don't resist. Become a part of it. Become part of the whole." "Leo." "No," I screamed. But he was already walking towards the wall, arms spread wide as if to embrace it. The darkness consumed him instantly. We didn't see his body. We only saw a black, writhing cocoon his size that for a second held the shape of a man, then collapsed to the ground, and the hum grew only louder, more saturated. This broke Anya. With a scream, she rushed to the spot where Leo had disappeared, and she was consumed. Mike, growling like an animal, grabbed me and Yulia and dragged us into the water. The icy water of the lake burned our skin, but it was a shock that brought us back to life. The mosquitoes didn't fly over the water. They lined up on the shore, a solid, pulsating black line, watching. We swam. Where to? Away. Just away. I paddled. He dragged the weakened Yulia. We swam for maybe an hour, maybe 2. The glacier's tongue drew nearer. Hope flickered. Reach the ice. They wouldn't be there. We scrambled onto a rocky spit at the foot of the glacier. Behind us, on the opposite shore, our nightmare stood like a dark stripe. But here, on the ice, they truly weren't. The silence deafened us. All we could hear was our heavy breathing and the splash of water. Mike set Yulia down on the rocks. We collapsed next to her, unable to speak. The silence was first broken by Yulia's weak moan. She propped herself up on an elbow and looked at her leg. On her ankle, in a bite wound scratched raw to the flesh, something was moving, something white and tiny. She screamed and began to scratch at her skin with her nails, but it wasn't on the outside, it was inside. I looked at my own hands, at every inflamed, festering bite, and I felt it. A slight, barely perceptible movement under the skin. A tickling, living sensation. Mike met my gaze. His eyes were full of the same horror, the same understanding. They had laid them inside us, their larvae. They hadn't just drunk our blood, they had used us. As incubators, as a warm, nutrient-rich medium for their new swarm. We hadn't escaped. We had simply brought them with us. We are sitting on this rock now, in the shadow of the glacier. We don't speak. We listen. To the silence outside. And to the quiet, inexorable stirring inside. The waiting. The waiting for something new and hungry to awaken and break free. All we can do is wait. And listen as my own skin begins to quietly